Right. So today we are diving into some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
A foiled terrorist plot.
Wow.
And this is right here in Canada.
Here in Canada, yeah.
So 2 teenagers in Ottawa, they were arrested
Okay.
for allegedly planning to bomb a pro-Israel rally.
Oh, wow.
And the details are, well, they're pretty unsettling, to say the least.
I bet.
This was all reported by Global News. And you know what? You might be surprised to hear what they were allegedly planning to use to build this bomb.
Interesting.
We'll get to that, though.
Okay.
First, let's break down what we know about what happened
Yeah.
and try and get a better understanding of what the motivations behind this disturbing plot could have been.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, where do we even begin with a story like this?
Well, I think it's important to kind of zoom out for a second and realize that this case isn't happening in a vacuum, right? Like,
Right.
we've unfortunately been seeing this concerning rise in antisemitism and extremism across Canada. And, I think that kind of provides a really critical backdrop for understanding the specific incident.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think sometimes these things can seem to come out of nowhere.
Right.
But when you look at the broader context, it's like, oh, okay, there are these worrying trends that have been developing for a while.
Okay, so let's talk about the timeline of this specific plot then.
Sure.
What do we actually know about when all of this was happening?
So the Global News article, it kind of lays out this timeline that starts last fall.
Okay.
That's when these 2 teenagers allegedly started planning the attack.
Right.
And then one of them was arrested in December, and then the other one was arrested in February.
Okay, so a few months apart.
Yeah, exactly.
And the article, it mentions that the authorities believe their plan might have been accelerated by the Hamas attack
Yes.
in October 2023.
Right.
So what does that mean in this context? What do they mean by accelerated?
So basically, it suggests that while these teens might have already been on a path towards radicalization, maybe they were already dabbling in extremist ideologies or online communities.
Okay.
These events in the Middle East, the Hamas attack specifically, it may have acted as a trigger for them.
Oh, I see.
You can kind of think of it this way. They may have already held those extremist views,
Right.
but the attack, it might have just strengthened their resolve in a way,
Yeah.
It might have provided this twisted sense of justification or this urgency to act,
Wow.
And this kind of, this copycat effect, it's not uncommon, unfortunately.
Oh, really?
We see it in other cases where global events, especially these big violent ones, they can really push individuals who are already vulnerable to extremism over the edge.
So they might have been heading down that path already, but then seeing something like that happen maybe gives them the push to actually follow through with it.
Exactly.
That's a pretty chilling thought.
It is.
And to make things even more disturbing, one of the teens was allegedly found with acetone, oxidizer, and metal ball bearings.
Yeah, those materials, those are definitely some serious red flags.
Yeah.
They're often used in improvised explosive devices, and so finding them in the possession of someone who's suspected of planning an attack, that's a huge cause for concern.
Absolutely.
It really raises the stakes.
Right.
And it makes you think, okay, this wasn't just talk, this wasn't just online chatter. They were potentially taking concrete steps towards actually carrying out this attack.
And then, of course, there's this possible ISIS connection that Global News reported, right?
Yeah.
Citing Canada's Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center.
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell us about that aspect of it?
Well, if this connection is true, it's incredibly significant.
Yeah.
It suggests that these teens weren't just acting alone. They may have been influenced or even directed by a global terrorist organization.
Wow.
And we know that these groups, they often exploit online platforms to spread their propaganda.
Right.
And issue what we call calls to violence, which can be particularly dangerous for individuals who are already struggling with feelings of isolation or alienation or anger.
Yeah, or maybe people who are looking for something to belong to or some kind of purpose.
Exactly. And, these groups can prey on those feelings of vulnerability.
Right.
And they offer this distorted sense of belonging and purpose.
It's almost like a perfect storm then, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
You've got these teenagers who might be vulnerable to these extremist ideas, and then you have this global conflict that just fuels those ideologies even more.
Right, exactly.
And then on top of that, you potentially have this direct influence from an organization like ISIS.
Yeah, it creates this really dangerous mix.
And that's why I think, the reactions from Canadian officials have been so strong.
Oh, absolutely. And I think they have every right to be concerned.
So Shimon Koffler-Fogel
Yeah.
from the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, He called this news unsurprising, given what he called the current climate of violent and radicalized protests.
And Rachel Downshow, who's the shadow minister for public safety, she's demanding a full investigation into this.
Yeah.
What do you think stands out to you from their responses?
Well, I mean, it's clear that they're both deeply concerned about the rising antisemitism and also the increasingly violent nature of some protests. I think they're both saying that this incident is a symptom of a much larger problem that we need to address.
Right. I think that's exactly what they're getting at.
Yeah.
They're highlighting this really urgent need for the government to step in and actually do something to address these issues. And I think they're right to sound the alarm.
Yeah, they're not sugarcoating it at all.
No. And, Deborah Lyons, who's Canada's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism, she didn't mince words either.
Right.
She used some really strong terms, like incitement, gaslighting of Jews, and glorification of terrorism.
Yeah, and those terms really emphasize how serious this situation is, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to understand what she means by those terms, especially for folks who might not be familiar with them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
So, incitement, that's basically the act of encouraging violence or hatred against a specific group.
Okay.
And then gaslighting, that's a form of manipulation where someone tries to make you doubt your own sanity or experiences.
Right.
So, for example, denying that the Holocaust happened or downplaying the impact of anti-Semitism.
So it's kind of making people question their own reality.
Exactly. It's a really insidious form of manipulation.
Yeah, and then glorification of terrorism.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that one kind of speaks for itself.
It does, yeah. It's pretty straightforward.
Right.
But I think what Lyons is getting at is how dangerous this kind of rhetoric can be and how it really contributes to this climate where extremism can thrive.
Yeah, because if you're constantly hearing this kind of language and these justifications for violence, it can really warp your worldview.
Exactly. It normalizes these extreme viewpoints and makes it seem like violence is an acceptable solution.
Right. So to kind of recap what we've learned in this deep dive, 2 teenagers in Ottawa were allegedly planning a bombing attack, and it seems like they might have been planning on using homemade explosives.
Right.
There are some serious concerns about a potential ISIS connection.
Yes.
And Canadian officials are deeply worried about the rising anti-Semitism and extremism that they see as contributing factors to this whole situation.
It's a lot to take in, for sure.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's heavy stuff.
It really is, and it leaves us with some really important questions to think about, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this case really highlights how complex this whole issue of radicalization is, right?
Yeah.
There's this web of factors that can contribute to it, from, personal vulnerabilities to global events to the influence of these online communities and propaganda.
And if this plot was indeed accelerated by the Hamas attack, as the authorities are suggesting,
Right.
what does that tell us about the possibility of seeing more copycat attacks? Or maybe even further escalation of violence?
Yeah. It's definitely a worrying trend.
It really is, and I think this whole incident is a wake-up call.
For sure.
It underscores this really urgent need to understand and address the root causes of extremism in our society.
I agree.
It's something we all need to be thinking about.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you're interested in learning more about this, about radicalization and how we can work together to prevent tragedies like this from happening in the future, I encourage you to explore some of the resources that are available online.
Yeah, I second that.
There's a lot of great information out there.
There is.
And I think, the more we understand about this issue, the better equipped we'll be to address it.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to leave it for today.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's been a really insightful conversation.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.